Hi everyone, my name is Arielle Santos and I am the Policy Program Coordinator here at CTUC. I am on the North Shore of Long Island today to talk to you guys about the adorable piping plover. So who is the piping plover? The piping plover is a migratory shorebird. So let's break those words up. Migratory, meaning that they travel from one place to another, usually great distances, from wintering grounds to breeding grounds typically. And a shorebird, being that they feed right off of the shore, right off of the rack line towards the water. So the piping plover is a tiny, tiny shorebird. They're between a sparrow and a robin-sized bird. And they have a white chest, gray wings, a black headband, black chest band, and they make these huge migrations from places all along the southern United States, like Florida. They'll also migrate from places like the Bahamas, and they'll fly all the way up here for their breeding season. Our population is called the Atlantic Coast population, but there's actually two other populations called the Great Lakes and the Great Plains population. So from mid-March to early April is when they'll start flying up here. They'll come to places like this on the North Shore, and they'll start to try to find their mate. So they have some pretty funny practices that they'll do. The male will create what's called a scrape in the sand. So that's basically just a small indentation in the sand. He'll push some of this sand aside. He'll decorate it with shells and rocks. And the hopes is that a female will pick his scrape to lay eggs in. Another thing that he'll do is called tattooing or high stepping. And he'll also create what's called a figure 8 formation, flying over the scrape. And all of those actions is to get a female to pick his scrape to lay eggs in. So once she does do that, she will lay an egg every other day until it reaches a full clutch size, which is 4 eggs. And as you might have noticed, she lays them directly on the sand. She'll lay them in those scrapes. And they're actually super well camouflaged. They look like rocks. They're tiny, they're speckled. So it's really hard to see, which is good for them because it makes it harder for predators to find them. So after about 27 days, which is their incubation period, is when those eggs will hatch. But before we get to that, I want to talk to you a little bit about their incubation period. I think it's really neat that both male and female plovers actually incubate the eggs. So for example, the female will be sitting on the eggs, and then the male will actually go to the water, forage, and then they'll tag team and tap off. So they're making sure that a bird is incubating at all times because it's extremely important that their temperature is being regulated, that they're being protected from predators and from environmental factors like a hot day like today. So they're really good parents. They're territorial. They're solitary nesters, unlike terns or black skimmers, who are colonial nesters. So you'll see them congregating in a big area, a bunch of them kind of together. But the piping plover and American oyster catchers are super territorial. They're solitary nesters, so you'll see them kind of alone, away from each other, which ties into how good of parents they are. So if there's predators around, like some of their natural predators are foxes and crows, raccoons, feral cats. So if they see these predators around, some things that they'll do is called feigning a broken wing. So what they'll actually do is they'll walk away from the nest and they'll pretend like they have a broken wing. So the predator goes for them instead of the nest, which I think is super clever. But if there's just too high of predation, if it gets to be a little too much for them, they'll actually abandon the nest, which we don't want. You know, they can only try so hard, but if it gets too dangerous, they'll abandon the nest and they'll try to go somewhere else where it's not as dangerous for them to nest, which is not a good thing because, like we know, we need to keep these eggs protected from environmental factors and from predation. So in the best case scenario, after 27 days and the incubation goes well, these eggs will hatch. And what's really cool about piping plovers is that these chicks are called precocial, which means that unlike robins and other songbirds, they have a body full of feathers, they're ready to go. They can just walk straight towards the rack line and start feeding, which is pretty impressive. Terns and skimmers aren't quite like that. So those birds, their parents have to go to the rack line or go out into the water and skim for fish and bring it back to those nests. So biologists try to get to this point, and a point what's called fledging, because once they can fledge is when they can evade from predators, which is super important because these birds are super tiny and they're super camouflaged as well. So when they're bouncing in between the rack line, it leaves them open to predators. And I'll walk you guys down there so you can see where they feed and some of the things that they feed on. For example, they'll feed on marine worms, invertebrates, and they'll just dart in and out to make sure that they're accumulating enough energy, because as you know, they have a long trek back to their wintering grounds. So we'll walk you over there in a second. So as you can see, this is the rack line. So for a specific location like this, you can see they have actually a pretty decent walk all the way towards the water here. And they'll stick their bill into the wet sand and try to find some snacks, like those marine worms and invertebrates that we were talking about. So they walk all the way down there and then back up here, which is actually where they nest and they rest. So there's been some nests that have been seen here last year. I don't believe there's a nest here this year that I know of yet. But this is a pretty long walk, so you can imagine that they'd be pretty open to predators and other interactions that might not be great. So you're probably wondering, so what? Why are we learning about the piping plover right now? What's so important about those guys? And what's important about them is that they're actually federally threatened birds, so they're protected under the Endangered Species Act. And in New York, they're actually endangered. So if you notice on this beach, there's this sort of weird fencing here, right? So conservationists take a number of measures to try to protect these birds. This being one of them. This is called symbolic fencing. And as you can see, it says this is a restricted area. And you're probably wondering why this would be a help to them. And because we went over some of their natural predators, like feral cats and crows and foxes and whatnot. But what actually also puts them in danger is interactions with humans and human disturbances. So how did we get to this point? Why are they New York State endangered? Why are they federally threatened? And it's due to a lot of habitat loss and this human disturbance. So this particular nesting area, this part of the beach, sometimes gets lost to, of course, as you can see, recreational usage, residential and commercial buildings and whatnot. So all this important nesting area is being lost, so they can't build up their population. So some measures that are being taken is to protect some of this crucial nesting habitat. So this symbolic fencing is put up to keep people out of the nesting area, to give these birds some space. So it's made out of this fishing line, well, not fishing line, but this string line with flagging tape, and these posts, kind of like what stop signs are put on. And it'll create this boundary between us, the plovers, and the eggs. Because as we've learned, they nest directly on the sand. So if we're walking in and out of these areas, the probability of us seeing those eggs is really low because they're super camouflaged and they're right out on the sand and they look exactly like those rocks. So conservationists will put up this fencing Another thing is, you know, public outreach and education. So like what we're doing today, tell your friends and family. And some other things that are done are research and tracking of these birds. Another thing that is done that I forgot to touch on is what's called a predator exclosure. So it's kind of this circular cage that is built around a nest. It's dug a foot underneath the sand to keep foxes from burrowing underneath. It's made out of turkey wire so plovers can go in and out. And then there's netting on the top to protect from avian predators. And so that is to protect them from their natural predators so we can get those eggs to hatch, keeping them out. So some other research that is done is what's called tagging. And you've probably seen images of birds being tagged with colored bands. They usually have an alphanumeric code on it, which is just a fancy word for something that has letters and numbers on it. And that is to track populations of birds, to find out or figure out more about their migratory patterns, and to learn more about them so we can protect them. I think New York has orange bands and the Bahamas pink. Virginia Tech is green. So we can track where they're going, how fast they're going there. If I see one plover with an orange band here, and then someone sees them somewhere else a few days later, you know, that gives us information about how they're traveling and how fast. So it's really important that we're protecting these birds because they're New York State endangered. So keeping our distance from them, making sure that they are having the space that they need to nest, because as we've also learned, if they get spooked, if there's too many people around, they'll abandon those nests. And those nests will never be able to hatch, which is of course not what we want. So we need to give these birds the space that they need, especially during this time of having to stay home or not being able to go most places. So a lot of people are taking advantage of the outdoors, going to the beach, which is good of course. But that means that there's no stewards working and talking to people about the birds and what they can do to help. So it's important that we are learning what we can do to help. And that's respecting these fenced off areas, keeping dogs off of nesting beaches, because if you can imagine a crow spooking a bird away from a nest, you can imagine that a big scary dog would spook them as well. And also making sure you leave the beach the way that you found it. So keeping litter off the beach, making sure that you bring trash home with you, because that trash will attract predators, making them more apparent, making those nests more apparent, kind of leading them to that area, which of course is not what we want. Audubon New York has some great resources. You could take a pledge online. It's called the Be a Good Egg Pledge, which is basically promising to do all of those things. And they have some great resources to learn more about the piping plover, what you can do to help. So make sure you check them out. And yeah, I hope everyone is doing okay, being safe, enjoying the outdoors responsibly. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. I'll try to answer all of them as best as I can. And I hope you all have a good day. Thanks for tuning in.